This is a single day's food ration for a person in the city of Leningrad in the winter of 1941. A scrap of bread the size of a deck of cards, part of it sawdust, and for many, it was not enough to stay alive. For 872 days, one of the great cities of the world was sealed off and slowly starved by the German army. More than 1 million people would die, most of them not from bombs or bullets but from sheer hunger and cold. This is the siege of Leningrad, the longest and deadliest siege in modern history. It is a story of almost unimaginable suffering and of a defiance that has very few equals in the history of the world. To understand it, you have to understand this was not an accident of war or a supply line that simply failed. The slow death of Leningrad was the plan, drawn up in cold blood. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, one of his 3 great army groups drove north, straight for Leningrad, the birthplace of the Russian Revolution. But Hitler did not simply want to capture the city, he wanted to erase it. His orders were chilling. Leningrad was to be wiped from the face of the earth. Rather than lose men storming its streets, the Germans decided to surround the city, cut off all its food and fuel, and simply let its population starve to death. By September of 1941, the ring was closed. German and Finnish forces had sealed off the city, trapping nearly 3 million civilians inside, along with the soldiers defending it. Leningrad was not some small outpost. It was a city of nearly 3 million people, full of art and music and history, and it had just become a prison and for many a tomb. Its soldiers and its people were now utterly alone, cut off from the rest of the country, with a savage winter closing in and the food already running dangerously low. At first the Germans shelled and bombed the city almost daily. Huge guns hurled shells into the streets, and early in the siege the great food warehouses burned, a catastrophe the city could not afford. As autumn turned to winter, the food began to run out. Rations were cut again, and then cut again. By the depths of that first winter, the daily bread ration for most people had fallen to just 125 grams, a few thin slices, bulked out with sawdust and cellulose. People queued for hours in the freezing dark for that scrap of bread, and for many, it was very nearly all they would eat in a day. The bakeries ran day and night, stretching the last of the flour with anything they could find, cellulose, cottonseed, sawdust, just to keep some kind of bread moving to the people. Soldiers at the front got a little more, but for the workers, the elderly, and the children, that tiny ration was often the difference between living another week and not. Then came one of the coldest winters on record, and the city had no fuel. The power failed, the heating died, the water pipes froze solid. People burned their furniture and their books just to stay warm. They melted snow and chipped ice from the frozen river to drink. Every ordinary task became a battle. Fetching a bucket of water, finding a scrap of fuel, climbing a flight of stairs, each one burned energy that a starving body no longer had to give. And they began to starve. Hunger stalked every home. The weak, the old, and the very young died first, quietly in their cold rooms. The dead became a constant, terrible sight, lying in the snow of the streets, or dragged to the cemeteries on children's sleds by relatives too weak to dig a grave. And in the worst days, hunger drove some to unspeakable acts. A dark trade in human flesh appeared in the starving city. The suffering is almost impossible to grasp, but it survives in a few short lines in the diary of an 11-year-old girl named Tanya. In a small notebook she recorded one by one the deaths of her family, her sister, her grandmother, her brother, her uncles, her mother. Her final entries read simply, "The Savashevs are dead, everyone is dead, only Tanya is left. She was evacuated at last, but her body was broken, and she too would die before the war ended." Her diary has become one of the most haunting records of the entire war, a whole city's agony written out in the plain hand of a child. There was only one way in or out of the trapped city, a great cold lake on its edge called Lake Ladoga. When the lake froze hard enough, the Soviets built a road across the ice itself, and they called it the Road of Life. Convoys of trucks crawled over the frozen lake through blizzards and darkness, carrying precious food into the city, and carrying the starving and the children back out. It was appallingly dangerous. German guns and aircraft hunted the convoys, and the ice could split without warning. Countless trucks vanished through the surface into the black water below. The drivers kept their cab doors open and one foot out on the running board, ready to leap clear the instant the ice began to give way beneath them. In summer, when the ice melted, boats ran the same deadly gauntlet across open water. That thin, fragile thread was all that kept the city alive, and over the siege it carried out more than 1 million people. And through all of it, incredibly, the city refused to surrender. Starving workers kept the factories running, turning out shells and repairing tanks for the front, and sometimes collapsing dead at their machines. Teenagers took the places of the dead at the lathes. Museums buried their treasures underground. Even in a dying city, somehow, life refused to stop entirely. Anti-aircraft crews fought back from the rooftops. Ordinary citizens dug trenches and cleared rubble on rations that were slowly killing them. And in the summer of 1942, in a city of the walking dead, an orchestra of half-starved musicians performed a brand new symphony, Shostakovich's Seventh, written partly inside the siege itself. Finding enough musicians was itself a struggle. Conductor Karl Eliasberg searched hospitals and military units for surviving players, and the orchestra received extra rations simply to become strong enough to rehearse. Some musicians were too weak to hold their instruments. Empty chairs marked those who died before the performance, and rehearsals sometimes stopped because no one had the strength to continue. On the day of the concert, Soviet artillery struck German gun positions to keep them silent. Then loudspeakers carried the symphony across the city and directly toward the siege lines. It was broadcast by loudspeaker across the city and out toward the German lines, an act of pure defiance that told the enemy and the people themselves that Leningrad still lived. Those who were there said that for the length of that music, they forgot their hunger and remembered that they were still human and still free. A German soldier who heard that broadcast from the siege lines later admitted that in that moment he knew they would never take the city. Men who could still play like that would never give in. Slowly, month by month, the city endured. The second winter was less deadly than the first. Little by little, the ration improved, and the Red Army fought to break the ring. In January 1943, Soviet troops finally smashed a narrow corridor through the German lines, opening a slender land route into the city at last. And in January 1944, a full year later, a great Soviet offensive drove the Germans back for good and lifted the siege completely. On the 27th of January 1944, after 872 days, the guns fell silent, and Leningrad lit fireworks over its shattered but unconquered skyline. Around them stood the wreckage of one of the most beautiful cities in the world, its palaces scarred, its parks turned into graveyards, but it was still standing and it was still theirs. The cost had been beyond almost anything in modern experience. More than 1 million people, the vast majority of them civilians, had died, most from simple starvation. Whole families had simply vanished. In some apartment blocks, when spring finally came, there was almost no one left alive at all. There was scarcely a family in the whole city that did not lose someone. A whole generation would carry the memory of that first winter for the rest of their lives. It was one of the most lethal blockades in all of history, and by some measures the deadliest siege the world has ever known. More people died in the siege of Leningrad than in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. It is a scale of suffering almost impossible to truly hold in the mind. But the city had held. Hitler's plan to wipe Leningrad off the earth had failed, and the huge German force that surrounded it was tied down for years, unable to fight anywhere else. For nearly 900 days, a huge part of the German army sat frozen outside a city it could not enter, while the true fate of the war was decided far away to the south. Leningrad became a symbol of endurance for the whole Soviet Union, a place where ordinary people chose to suffer and die rather than give in. The little girl's diary, the ration of bread, the road across the ice, the symphony in the ruins. That is how we remember a city that starved and would not fall. Next time, Pearl Harbor, the attack that brought the United States into the war. After that, you decide. Tell us which battle or campaign we should cover in the comments.